I don't think that Professor Nag needs a reintroduction, so I'm going to take it for granted that you know who he is. He's the author of the book, former Managing Director General of the Asian Development Bank. What I'm here to do is recap in less than a minute what he said for over an hour. So here it is, my minute goes now. In the last lecture, we essentially talked about the wheel of development. There are four essential wheels. That's transparency, accountability, adaptability, so on and so forth. And then we also talked about what freedom is and how it contributes to development. So if I have to put it in a nutshell, it'll be something like, remember what Rabindranath Tagore said about freedom, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high. That is also a version of development. Two key things that Professor Nag stressed in his lecture is to keep on thinking about development, economic growth, not just from the point of view of money or dollar signs, but niti and nyaya. Let these two things be a cornerstone for how you view development. When we think about everything that is going around us, one important question keeps on coming up is how important and how bad is corruption. So the midpoint of the lecture and also the ending of the lecture stressed a very important thing. Corruption is not inborn. There's absolutely nothing that makes one society more corrupt or less corrupt. And all of this was concluded by giving out a definition of development, which is that development should not be extractive, but should build freedom from the ground up. So that was the summary. And now I'm now going to invite Professor Nag to come and deliver the second lecture, which is going to be about mind and actions. So today he's going to be taking us through what economic growth and development looks like once we take a look at it from the newer behavioral economic model of economic growth. But without further ado, Dr. Nag.
Lecture today and last time started actually on the dot at 2:30. That's fantastic. That's great. Thank you. Okay, Amok, thanks very much for having given a absolutely precise summary, capsule of that. A point that I had made and which I'll emphasize today. Institutions are critical for delivering good governance. And I had said that institutions can be formal, constitution, rules and regulation, laws, but they also are informal. And that is actually a more important factor, quite frankly, because constitutions can always be written, laws can always be written and even passed. It's how you implement it and how people look at law. Why are laws followed in some countries and not in others? It's nothing again inherent that some people are more law-abiding than others. So informal institutions determine that behavior. And I also made the point that we cannot and should not think of disciplines as silos, just economics. The good governance is economics. I have mentioned about the importance of politics. And today, I'll really bring in elements of psychology. And a point that we will keep facing is this whole concept of governance in institution has to talk about economics, politics, psychology, anthropology, game theory, etc. Okay, so please keep that broadly in mind. And this is why, whether you're an engineering student or economics or management or medicine, you all belong here, because good governance and importance of institutions relevant for everybody. Okay, so let me start with today's lecture. I had made the point in the first one that neoclassical economics essentially was institution neutral. They said institutions, not that it doesn't matter, but it's sort of, it's not an important factor, and anyways, the law of large numbers comes in and it cancels out. And that was because there is a very fundamental assumption, and those of you from the economics faculty would immediately recognize it. There is the assumption of the perfect rational being. This person, called Homo economicus, for want of a better word, is perfectly rational, perfectly consistent. And one economist had defined this person to be a person who thinks like Albert Einstein, has the mental capacity of keeping information and processing and recalling it as a supercomputer, and can exercise the willpower of Mahatma Gandhi. Okay? So this person is a robotic person who is always rational, always sort of knows exactly what the issues are and makes a call. Now, of course, we're not robots, we're humans. And therefore, all of these assumptions of perfect rationality, perfect information, perfect capacity is obviously not quite correct. And this means that instead of being fully rational, we all are bounded in a rationality. Okay? We give in to temptation. Yeah? We procrastinate. We basically say, oh, well, the assignment is due on Tuesday, today is only Sunday, so I'll just watch T20 match. We all know we have difficulty with diet, which the economicus, Homo economicus, never does, because she or he is perfectly rational. They know it's not good to eat more than you need to, and don't. We see a piece of chocolate, and we say, oh, well, next time. Okay? We are also a member of society. So what I feel is influenced by what you feel. I am caring at times, and I'm selfish at times. I'm not a robot. I am sympathetic, I reciprocate, but I'm also mean. So the reality is that human beings are neither the devil nor the angels. And that's the reality. And we do not live unto ourselves in an island. We are a part of a family, we're part of a community, we're part of a society. So, if we take all of this, then the neoclassical assumption of institution neutrality doesn't hold anymore. And really, till about the 1970s, as I said last time, economics went on the assumption that institutions are not that critical. And now we know they are. And that is driven to a large extent by the factors I just mentioned, that we are complex, we are contradictory, we are all of the above. So, what it means is we have to think of how we think, how I think, you think. We have to think of how we think, etc., etc. So what I'll do is I'll first speak about a few minutes for individual thinking. Then I'll talk about social thinking. Then I'll talk about the society as a whole and take it from there. And at every point, I want you to keep remembering that reason we're doing all this is because that is how informal institutions develop. And in his Nobel Prize lecture, he started by saying, I've got a pen and a pencil, and The two of them together cost 110 rupees. The pen costs 100 rupees more than the pencil. What is the cost of the pencil? The instinctive answer, and I won't ask you, because it'll take time. The instinctive answer, and I said the same, and many others, 100, 10, 100, 800 more. No, the answer actually is 5, because if it's going to be 100 more, that means the pen would cost 105, the total would be 110. Now, don't feel bad if you thought it was 10, you would be in a majority. Most people, that is their immediate answer. And the reason it's an immediate answer has actually a very fundamental psychological parameter, phenomenon, called the automatic thinking. Over time, through the evolution of humans, we started to realize that we can't always stop to think before we act. Just imagine, you're a bushman and you see a black and yellow striped animal going by, and you stop to say, well, is that a cat or is that something else? Is it a big cat, small cat? And even if it's a big cat and the name tiger came later, maybe he really won't attack me. Maybe he's not, carnivorous. Now, you don't have time to think all of that, because by the time you've thought through, he would have done what he has to do. So we learned by experience, human evolution, of what is called act fast, flee, run and flee. And that was because if you stop to think, you would not live the day. And that happens to us all the time. In many things that you think of, somebody says something, you immediately answer. And it's not because you're being impulsive, that is human nature. And that's a very important aspect of institutions, and I'll talk about that. But then suppose I said, what is 17 times 24? You'd say, 17 times 24, you'll pull out your calculator, you do this. You won't immediately give an answer, whereas you would in the first one. 17 times 24, by the way, is 408. And that's only because I've got it written down. This thinking is what is called reflective thinking. So the first one is automatic, the second one is reflective. And this is a very fundamental aspect, and of course those who are in psychology will recognize it, that we think automatically, and in psychology it's called system 1, and we also think reflectively. The system 2. Now system 2 is lazy. She just sits back and says, I'll get involved only in the more important matters. What is the automatic thinking, which first of all is quick, immediate. You see a hot stove, you put your hand, you take it away. You can't sort of keep it there and say, well, is it really going to cause more damage, etc. But the automatic system is the one which says to reflective, hey, buddy, come in, I can't solve it. And we will see where some of these automatic and reflective system 1, system 2 thinking has a major influence. Take the example, and the examples I'm giving, I won't get into details, but these are all real life examples. These studies have all been done, very sort of well-established studies. Sugarcane farmers in UP. Obviously, just before harvest, they are quite money poor. Huh? They're waiting for the harvest. He's worried about how much labor he can get to do the harvesting. His money is all gone. He's going to sell and then get. And his daughter comes home and says, oh, Papa, I forgot to tell you, my fees are due day after tomorrow. Oh, fees? I don't have money. So this person who is already under cognitive stress because he's under the stress of the money he doesn't have, he's under the stress of finding laborers for his harvest, and the daughter comes and says, fees are due. And the principal has said, if I don't pay, I'm out. It was seen, not just UP, UP is the case study, but in many places, they said, well, too bad, he withdraws his daughter from school. Now, that is because he was not bringing his reflective system of thinking in play. So he said, well, what can I do? I don't have money. Okay, so, Whereas if he had sat back and thought, well, maybe he could have gone to the principal and said, can you give me a month? Or he could have gone to, the bank or whatever. More importantly, the policymakers, the school administration should have recognized that farmers will be under this stress. So don't put the fees being due on the day before the harvest money comes. Why not put it after? And this cognitive stress leads the poor to often make suboptimal decisions. And if we recognize that this feature is not irrational, it is very rational. It's not that the farmer doesn't want to educate his daughter. It's just that, he's thinking, oh, I can't handle this anymore. Now, the automatic system obviously wants to be fast and frugal, right? Because that's how but it also leads to, as we just saw, suboptimal or even the wrong decision. AIDS, when AIDS was sort of first diagnosed, people didn't know what to do, but over time, the cocktail of medicines were fairly well established. And the medicines were available fairly widely, okay? All over the world. I'm talking about in a broad swath. But it was found that many people still didn't take the medicine. And they couldn't figure out why. It was not a price issue. It was not an availability issue. What it was the cognitive stress of the poor mother, poor single mother, who had worked the whole day, A, B, and C, and at night she just didn't have the energy to think of her medicine, she didn't take it. And that was because her automatic thinking was, I'll take it tomorrow. Her reflexive thinking, if she had time to think, would have been, hey, just a minute, it's too risky. So what they did in places where the experiment was done, they used to, at 6 o'clock, mass SMS was possible. They used to send a reminder at 6 o'clock to people, and thousands of, tens of thousands, don't forget to take your medicine today. And that did it. That was all that was needed. And that was informal institution. Formally, they would say, what more can we do? We've provided the medicines, it's cheap, it's so on. But the fact is, she was under cognitive stress, which she had to recognize, Okay, so it's important how this is framed. In the emergency rooms in hospitals, patient comes in apparently from a heart attack, and yet they can't afford to sort of open everybody up and put a stent. So some doctors in Chicago came up with some heuristics to help this automatic thinking process. They obviously had good psychologists on their team. And the three simple rules is the patient over 62 and a half? Is the higher blood pressure, the upper blood pressure, less than 91? And is there evidence of what is called the sinus tachycardia, which means when you see the ECG, your heart rate is more than 100, but it is otherwise sinusoidal. The ECG is normal, but the heart rate is sort of, That they said, if you get answer to these three, immediately go for assuming his heart rate. Saved thousands and millions of lives just on that heuristics. Okay? Again, it is an informal recognition, informal institution by the recognition of how we think, which if you ignore, obviously, is critical. Now, on the other hand, because you want to be fast and frugal, sometimes you might frame it too narrowly, which is what our sugarcane farmer did. He was framing it narrowly. I don't have money, therefore the girl has to come out of school. Instead of saying, okay, just take a pause. I don't have money. What are my options? Okay. Now, it's also important to think in terms of that framing of the information to make sure that the salient information is obvious, which means that you have to make information is just too much sometimes. You've got to frame it in a way that the person can immediately pick on and react. Again, you go to a doctor, you go to a surgeon and have a pre-surgery discussion. And she wants to be very truthful, she wants to be upfront. So she says, well, out of the 100 people who have had this surgery, 10 are dead after 5 years. Fact. And your automatic thinking immediately says, run. I'm nothing to do with this. 10 are dead, my God. The other way, if you recognize the salient information, is still the automatic system. The surgeon says, well, Mr. Nag, yeah, obviously there are risks, but 90% of the people are alive 5 years after the surgery. And I said, well, that's a reasonable risk. Okay? Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed in the fundamental information. But the automatic thinking process has kicked in with the right and salient information. Because see, once we say, after 10 years, 5 years, 10 are dead, my automatic thinking immediately kicks in. It doesn't go to the reflective to say, oh, that only means, 10%, which is not bad. 90% alive. I don't go through that process. So the issue of salience of information for the automatic and reflective system is critical. Okay, let me take another example. Pressing bias of the present. The so-called, this sounds sort of highfalutin. What it really means is procrastination. Okay? We basically, human nature, push it off if you can and then sort of see what happens. In Africa, in Kenya, they were very concerned, and this is actually a worldwide phenomenon, but the study I'm referring to is in Africa, in Kenya, done actually by Nobel Prize winner Esther Duflo. And they said, why are people not using fertilizers as much as they should? Now you go to a neoclassical economist, or you go to an economist, he'll say, oh, obviously price is too high, subsidize. Oh, you don't have enough stores, so open some more stores. And you'd say, maybe they don't know the benefits of fertilizer, these poor farmers. So send in bunch of extension workers. Esther Duflo and her team said, well, let's try it out. Let's see if that's true. And what they found was that, no, the farmers knew very well the benefits of fertilizer. They didn't need to be told about that. Prices, well, not bad because the fertilizers are sold in small packets, so it's affordable. That was not a constraint. Distance from the store, yeah, it's a 30 minutes walk, but in that neighborhood, that's no big deal. So why are they not applying fertilizers? And once they brought in the behavioral economists, by the way, behavioral economists are economists who pretend to be psychologists, or the other way around too, and that's great. I want people to think that there's no boundary. What they found was that Immediately after the harvest, they are cash rich, okay, enough money. But when do they need the fertilizer? They need the fertilizer when they're cash poor because they need it during the sowing time and all of that. So they ask the farmers, well, you know you'll need it, so why don't you save? You say, yeah, yeah, exactly. That's what I always think I'll do. I'll save money for the fertilizer. But immediately after the harvest, we have celebrations, we have other things. Daughter's wedding comes up, so the money is spent. And he never gets to save. And then, when it comes to fertilizer application time, he is under the same cognitive stress as the farmer in UP. So he says, well, I'll do less with the fertilizer. And the consequence of the intent and action divide, procrastination, and cognitive stress means fertilizer application is much less. So what did Duflo and others decide? They said, okay, immediately after harvest, we will go to each farmer and sell them a voucher. That this voucher entitles you to get 5 kilograms of fertilizer when you need it, say 90 days from now. And the farmer is cash rich. He says, sure, here is the money. So he buys it. This is not a voucher for future payment. He buys it. And they arranged home delivery of fertilizer so that you didn't have to say, oh, I'll go tomorrow, I'll go there. And the application of fertilizer rate went up by 70%, which is actually more than what a 50% subsidy would have meant. So giving a subsidy, A, was going to be costly for the government, and you didn't need to do anything but tweak this behavioral aspect, changing the informal institution. Okay? So what I'm trying to get across is the informal institutions have a tremendous importance on economic development. And it recognizes the reality of we as human beings. Okay? You would say a perfect rational person would say, I need fertilizer and I need 10 rupees, I'll save 10 rupees. I've got 100 now, I'll put away 10. But we are humans, we're not Homo economicus, and therefore, econ for short, in the literature, these people, these robots are called econs. With apologies to economists here, but that's what the caricature is, okay? Okay, so that is for the individual. Okay, now, we also are, as I said, members of society. We care for others. Our thinking is influenced by what you think. And what I think ultimately is influenced by my compatriots. And again, many of you would have known many of these cases. They found that thin people have thin friends. And the reason is nothing but what I think you think is influence. So if I know that he's dieting or he's careful about food, then I'll hold back on the second paratha. But if my friend is splurging, then I say, oh, great, come on, bring it on. Okay? So we are influenced by our surroundings. And as I said, we are a mix of emotions. We cooperate, we don't cooperate, we are kind, we're not kind. And again, based on several psychological studies, what they found is we are what is called conditional cooperators. We're not cooperators in an altruistic sense that, I am Gandhi, and I slap me on one cheek, I'll turn the other. But we are what is called conditional cooperators. I'll cooperate if you cooperate. They found that we believe in what's called the tit for tat strategy. And I would never have thought I believe in tit for tat till actually you start to think, I will cooperate if you cooperate. And they did some very interesting experiments, and it showed that the tit for tat strategy is dynamic. I'll cooperate if you cooperate, but I think you're not cooperating, then I'll hold back. But they also found that people are forgiving. So I will not say I'll never cooperate with you, just because you didn't cooperate with me last year, but I'll watch. So it's an asymptotic relationship. The past has a greater influence, but it's not sort of, forever. So these features came into the discussion of institutions. Take pollution. We all know we're in deep trouble. And yet we say, well, what's the little thing that I can do if I don't switch off my fan or my electricity or whatever? And that's the very famous free rider problem. We want the benefit of lower pollution, but we don't sort of think there is much need for us to do anything. The typical collective action problem. And the very first paper written on this was way back in 1968 by an economist, Thomas Hardin, on the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons basically was, if you have been to Boston, there's an area in the center of town called the Commons. And herdsmen, in days, many days or decades gone by, they could bring their cattle to graze. Only thing is that you were expected to limit your cattle. Nobody sort of monitored it, but then they found that everybody said, well, if I take one more cow, what difference would it make? And very soon the entire commons was gone because everybody brought more cows than the capacity. So individually, we were better off by taking that extra cow, which was a free rider, but collectively we were worse off. Okay? And this is shown in a game theory context, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with what's called the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma, I'll need that to come on the screen now. Yeah, okay. So the prisoner's dilemma in a game theory, again, very well established, very common. It's a situation when two players, two sort of convicts, they have been caught by police. The police don't have much information to convict them. Some information. So they put the two players, or prisoner 1 and 2, and they say the following. The rules of the game are very clearly stated. That if you deny, but the other person confesses, then we will convict you on the basis of his confession, and the other way around. And then, of course, if you both confess, then we will convict you both. But because we'll be a bit generous, and if neither of you deny, then we'll have to convict you on the basis of what we know. So the first cell, player 1 denies, player 2 denies. So each go to jail for 2 years. Okay, because the police don't have any strong evidence otherwise. But they don't get away scot-free. But if player 1 denies, but player 2 confesses, same with the other matrix, the player 1 confesses and player 2 does not, therefore he gets 1 and player 2 gets 5. Both confess, they get 4 each. Okay? So now, from a community comprising of player 1 and 2, obviously cell 1 is the best, 2 and 2, both of them sort of spend 2 years. And therefore, both end up confessing to avoid a 5-year term and get a 4-year instead. Now, this is, again, looks very simple, but this has had a very fundamental impact on the whole concept of collective action. Exactly the same thing about grazing in the commons or pollution, green gas emissions, etc. I know that we both need to cooperate, but I'll cut my emissions by 20%, hoping that you would cut by 50, and then, of course, we'll both be better off. But of course, then neither of us do, and we end up what's called the Nash equilibrium. Again, that's too much of a detail, but Nash equilibrium is an equilibrium situation when you can't move away from it unilaterally, because the other person will be worse off. Okay? So they end up in this, it's a bad equilibrium for that. If a society of two, 4-4 is actually the worst situation. But that's what happens. And this is what happens so often in social intercourse. And this is what Professor Sen has said. Both of them are rational fools. They're rational because they've done what's best for them, but they're fools because they've ended up with that 4-4. Okay? Keep this in mind because this is something we'll keep coming back to. Okay, so what influences our social thinking? Three factors. One is beliefs, second, norms, and the third is called mental model. I'll discuss each of them in turn, but just keep these three in mind that our thinking as society is influenced by essentially not only me as an individual and my automatic thinking, my reflective thinking, and all of that, but also our social thinking, which is influenced by belief, norms, and mental model. Okay, beliefs. I've already said about the T-junction last time. I live in Gurgaon. And actually Amok saw that crossing on Friday when he went to drop me. And it's because I know that if I get into that crossing, I'll get stuck because, but I also know that if I don't, then I'll be here forever because I believe that she will also get into the crossing. So we both get in the crossing and the third one does and we are in a mess. In Washington, exactly the same situation, but the belief there is very different. The belief is, I will not get into it because she won't get into it and he won't get into it. We'll stop, each stop, look, proceed, come first, serve. Simple. Taxes. Tax authorities all over the world spend a huge amount of effort and money in collecting taxes. Why on earth don't these fellows pay? Okay, so we'll mount a campaign. If you don't pay, you go to jail. So we'll put posters, we'll put all of this. The taxes are due on April 30th or March 31st. And you must pay, must pay. Doesn't have much effect. In Britain, what they did, and Amok is very involved with that behavioral unit, they said, each one got a letter. So I'm living in Gurgaon, I get a letter saying, Dear Mr. Nanak, oh, by the way, you would want to know that 98% of your neighbors have paid taxes. End of story, didn't say anything more. And I said, oh my God, 98% have paid. And these have to be true. I mean, you can't make that up. So they obviously know all of this information. And they found in Britain, the tax collection went up significantly. And the way we did, because the belief was, why should I pay if she doesn't? But now I say, oh, that's not true. So the belief system can be changed by what are called nudges. And that's what this does. And these are, again, nothing but behavioral aspects which influence the informal institutions. In the US, several campuses, they still have this problem, but much less. In the mid-90s, they found binge drinking was a major challenge, major problem. Boys and girls drunk and etc. And they couldn't figure out why, etc. Everybody knows the ill effects, etc. And then they did a survey and found that a large number of boys usually are the most stupid ones, apologies, boys, they drank not because they wanted to drink, but because they thought their buddies were drinking. So that fellow must be drinking, and if he thinks he can drink, I'll show him one or two. And therefore, it was this whole thing about my belief about what he does. So the campaign was that on average, in this hostel or this campus, people consume one drink a day. And they found that the actual consumption was much less, or actually what they wanted to and what they did. So the people who were binging said, my God, I have been very stupid. I thought it was a much more serious thing. And immediately the consumption went down because it was a belief about what the other person was doing. Okay? And this is what, oh, and of course I'd also mentioned to you briefly about the Maghreb traders in the early ages, producers in the Middle East and other areas in North Africa couldn't go all the way to Europe to sell their wares. So they would sell their wares to intermediate trader of their own community, Maghreb community, who would then take it, sell it, and sell the money. Now, the belief was that he would not cheat. And the consequence of cheating was also quite high because once he was caught cheating, they'd never get business again, etc. But more fundamentally, it was the belief. And therefore, they came up with a very efficient system which served them very well for most thousands of years before they were taken over by developments in Italy. That's a separate story. But the whole financial trade transactions in the Maghreb area was based on a simple concept of belief or trust or whatever. Okay, so this is why a very well-known economist, you might have all heard his name, Kaushik Basu, he was the chief economic advisor in India some time back. He basically said, we are all citizens of the Republic of Belief. Everything we do, I come on time here because I believe you will be on time here, and the other way around, etc. David Hume, a philosopher, economist, way back in 1740, essentially talked about the centrality of beliefs in social interaction. And he writes something which is very interesting. I'm quoting him. No man would have reason to fear the fury of a tyrant, because all the power he, the tyrant, has physically is zero, because the tyrant is somewhere up there in the palace on the top of a hill. So what can he do to me? But the reason I fear is because I believe he will fear and therefore be an accomplice. And he does the same. So a community of the two of us or the three of us or 10 of us, just on this belief that the others will cooperate with the tyrant, gives him the power. And during the Czechoslovak dissident movement, Václav Havel said very much the same thing. That how does a regime hold such fear on the people? And it's only because people believe, not the tyrant is a tyrant, believe the others will fear and do what the tyrant says. Okay? So this concept of belief has very significant implications for day-to-day life. Okay, let me quickly go to norms, which is slightly different. I'd gone for dinner once in the US in the very early days, and dinner was served as a circular table, and I picked up the roll of bread, and suddenly, there was a bit of a commotion on the table. I had broken a norm which I didn't know, that you pick up the roll on the left. I had picked up, there are two plates, I just picked up from right. The moment I picked from right, of course, the whole didn't got disturbed. But more than that, I could actually sense that something was not right. It's only later that the hostess told me what had happened. Something very simple. Very simple, no big deal. But that's the norm. In Japan, if you are invited for dinner at 7:30, you arrive at the host house at 7:25, and you wait outside, and at 7:29 you walk to the door, and at 7:30 you ring the bell. And that's true. I mean, it's not just sort of my sort of exaggerated thinking, or in Korea, in East Asia in general. That's the norm. Now, here, which is something I did in the first few days, first few months of being back, I wasn't sure if I was more embarrassed, my wife and I, or my host, because the host was certainly not ready. The hostess was far from being ready. So we arrived on time and found the poor butler or the servant every 5 minutes coming, "Sab ab pani lenge, ab chai lenge." "Nahi, hum to kuch nahi lenge, hum to khana lenge just." So, and then we realized, of course we knew that, but the norms. So if a dinner is at 7:30 in Japan, the norm is you get there at 7:30. And as you might have read, a train left the Tokyo station once 7 seconds early, not late, early. And the chief of Japan Railways apologized to national TV that night, because some people had missed their train because they said, "Oh, when we came, the train was moving." So that's a norm. And norm is essentially socially enforced behavior. And there is no reason why it happens. It happens through history, but it's socially enforced. Belief is not enforced by anybody. But here, and there are two types of norms. One is called the empirical norm, where there is no consequence of my taking the roll from the wrong side of the plate was an empirical norm, in the sense that it caused a bit of a ruffle, embarrassment, but no big deal. But there are called the normative norms, which are very serious, which is expectation. Society will ostracize you if you don't. The dowry system, the female genital mutilation in Africa, these are very seriously detrimental norms, because society ostracizes you. Now, the interesting thing about some of these norms is not that everybody believes in it. In case studies done in Africa on FCG, FCM, FGM, it's not that parents wanted their daughters to be circumcised. They did it because they thought, what will others say? So, and of course now things have changed a lot, still there, and you might have read in the newspaper, Sudan is going back on some of its agreements. But norms can be bad or good. They can be good norms. Punctuality is a good norm. Being polite is a good norm. In Indonesia, speaking softly is a very good norm. Very good norm. I mean, if you speak loudly in Indonesia, people would go. The only trouble with that norm I found is that higher up you go, you speak even softer. So that by the time you are speaking to the chairman, you can hardly hear what he's saying because it's so soft, you have to strain your, that's a joke. I mean, it's actually a great norm. So these norms, good or bad, they just develop over time. The norm of reciprocity, the norm, as I mentioned to you last week, on the soccer field, you foul an opponent, but then you sort of help him to with your hand, extended hand. Now, in the classic prisoner's dilemma, if players 1 and player 2 came from a community where the norm was to trust, they would say, "No, he will never ditch me. I will not, confess, I'll deny." And both of them would have been better off. Okay? So the important point is that norms essentially make social life possible. We have norms for meeting people, we have norms for shaking hands, we have norms for greeting, we have norms for dating. I got into, and I still do actually, get into real confusion in France. I never know if you're supposed to, when you meet a lady, where they're supposed to bust her on the cheek thrice or twice or left or right. And of course, my eyes, my spectacles always get entangled with hers. But that's a norm. And, you know, it sometimes can be funny as this is, but there's a norm for everything. Some norms don't have, and norms have therefore what I call an efficiency, because it just makes it easier for people to interact. It's the grammar of society. When you meet people, you greet, you sort of shake hands or you say namaste or whatever. The trouble is when you don't know, so you do namaste and the other person extends hand. So those are interactions of society, which some of them can be serious, bad, and just results to a bad equilibrium. But the fact is, you've got to recognize the norms. And so norms are essentially shared patterns of behavior, socially enforced. That's the thing. I have to quickly go in because I know that I'm running out of time. Another 7 minutes I have. So the third one is thinking with mental models. Now, this is actually a much more serious thing. Norms are socially enforced, but sometimes, as I said, people know it's a bad norm. People know that, you know, dowries are not good, but, even though it's legally not allowed. So laws don't often have an influence on norms till the social behavior changes. Laws help. I mean, without an anti-dowry law, we'd probably have much more of it. But law by itself is not enough. Each country, not each, most of the countries in Africa have an anti-FGM law, but the application of it is obviously the larger issue. Okay, thinking with mental models. This one is something which gets programmed into ourselves through periods, decades of history in a community. That's what we start to think. It's not that we sort of, it's not automatic thinking so much as that becomes a belief system. And because life is complicated, we use these mental models, shortcuts, filters to come to a conclusion. Again, let me give you specific examples. The caste discrimination in India. Even when you don't believe in caste discrimination and would never do it consciously, it becomes so much a part of your mental model that you don't instinctively think. And many studies have shown that people of a lower caste, they also internalize this. So I'm not of a higher caste, therefore I should know my organ. And quite frankly, I used to think that that sort of must be only one way. That is, people of the lower caste must always be aware. Why should they take this unacceptable behavior? But I came across a study done in UP and then several others which confirms that the mental models become so much a part of our thinking, we react that way. And in many places, and again you will be able to identify, the people of a certain caste would not look you in the eye just because they think that, people of the higher caste, you're not supposed to. Now, of course, it comes from a centuries practice. You're not even supposed to walk on the same side of the street as the upper caste or whatever. In UP, and this is a more recent one, so I'm not talking just about history, a IQ test was given to class 5 and 6 students on a maze test. This was just basically matching pattern. 2 groups of students. One group, nobody knew the identity of the student. So each student sat in the class mixed. Nobody knew who they were. The performances of students were very much on the normal curve as you'd expect, no significant difference. In the control experiment, what they did was they read out the name of each student, including the surname, which meant the caste identity sort of became obvious to those who know. Many times you don't know, which is good, but most of them knew. And the results were staggering. The lower caste students scored 20% less than before. And the reason was that they immediately felt that, oh, I'm not supposed to be doing well. And the upper caste students felt, oh, I'll max it because I am the chosen. And really, I had a lot of difficulty accepting that this is reality. This is a fairly recent experiment. Uh, but Professor Sen made a very interesting observation. He asked, this is the other way around, he asked a colleague of mine once, he's from Bihar, and he said, what's the situation in Bihar? And my friend said, oh, nothing much, things are as bad here. And Professor Sen chewed him out. And Professor Sen, when did you go to Patna last? Or when did you go to Rajasthan last? I said, well, I was there recently. He said, did you notice that your domestic servant or your laborers on the field now, more often than not, will actually look you in the eye? As simple a phenomenon as that. And that is part of what we call the mental model. Okay? And this mental model is actually the most difficult to change because it's so much a part of one's history, culture, centuries, going back centuries. Okay? And this is, again, I've just given you examples from India, but there's studies all over the world. African Americans in US. And I'll just give another example and close. The slave trade, which started in West Africa around 1400, continued for about 500 years. And then has been now gone for almost 200 or 1.5. Interestingly, they found that people from that community in Western Africa, northern Western Africa, Gabon and others from where the slave trade began, the level of trust, mutual trust, is very low. So even when the people from there have moved to Germany or moved to wherever, they still don't trust others. They don't go to the banks. They don't trust the government. And again, couldn't figure out why would that be. And then an anthropologist fundamentally understood what had happened. 500 years back, the trust bond was broken when brothers sold brothers. Village chief sold 100 of his community people to the slave trader for money. So suddenly people realized that the person that I was trusting is actually the one who sold me into slavery. And therefore, at that time, the trust was a poor survival strategy. But 100 years have gone by, they still have that mental model of people that don't trust a stranger because God knows what he or she will do. Okay? So, three factors influencing our beliefs, our social interaction: beliefs, norms, and mental models. Now, this is all very fine, this is all very interesting, and you could be right to say, Professor, this is all very interesting, but what do we do? How do you change? I'll talk more about it next lecture. But let me tell you that changing beliefs and norms and mental models is possible. It is not immutable. Otherwise, I would not give this lecture. Otherwise, I'd say, well, this is all interesting anthropological question. The way to do it, and again, I'm giving a very sweeping statement based on a lot of work done by others, is that you need to enhance human agency. You've got to make people more capable of participating, and obviously enhance human agency, which means education and health. And again, evidence shows education, particularly of girls, has been a very critically important, empowering feature in a society. Educated people, again, these are rather, generalizations, but like all generalizations, they're true also, that the education enables people to be more socially aware. They are more demanding of voice. They will not take this business of, know your God. They will assert themselves. Education of girls has a much more empowering effect, not only on her, but also her family and her other members of the family, particularly female members of the family. And the other one is health. There's no point of trying to provide education if the person is not well enough to learn or well enough to go to school. So education and health are very important drivers of this human capability, which is, I believe, and this will be a major conclusion I'll draw next lecture, that the changes I'm talking about, which are very important, changes for the better, changing the bad equilibrium, moving to a better norm, or doing away with the bad norms but coming up with the good ones. And things like punctuality, again, no time, but if you read the details, Japan was well known for its unpunctuality in early 1900s. As a matter of fact, if I had time, I would give you a quiz saying, I'd describe and say which country is it, and you'd all say anything else but Japan. But Japan was not punctual, and during the Meiji Revolution, not 1900, 1800. And in 1868, when they had the Meiji Revolution, one of the things that the emperor changed, and such people are called norm entrepreneurs, people who change the norms, or at least start. Doesn't always have to be the emperor, it can be any social leader, it can be anybody for that matter. And those do change. Takes time, takes an awful long time. Changing mental models takes longer than anything else, but it can be done. And my belief is that health and education, empowerment of people, are ultimately the major drivers for this journey from here to Denmark.